Okay, in this video, I want to show you guys the differences between the UV tile and the packed UV workflows. So taking the same asset and having it so that the UVs are packed into a single tile versus packed into multiple tiles, and kind of show you guys why that's important in Substance Painter. So first, I'm going to go and show you, I have this exact same asset here, and I have a version of it where I've broken the UVs into multiple tiles. And then I have a version here where all the UVs for all these assets are packed into one tile. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump over to Substance Painter, and then we'll jump back in a second to show you guys what effect that has. So here's my example where all of my UVs are packed into a single UV shell. And so in this case, what I have is, okay, so here's what it looks like in Substance Painter, right? I just added a quick preset material to it, and so it's pretty good. What's nice about it is my Texel density is the same across it. I'll talk about Texel density in a second. And it's pretty simple, right? We have all of our assets combined into one UV tile, which means that when I export it, I'm going to have a very small handful of maps to work with. If I come over here, so we have our texture set list. Don't worry about the rest of these are from a different model. We have a single texture set list, right? So all of our texturing and our layers are packed into a single texture set list. And that's because I gave all those assets in Maya, let's go here, the exact same material, right? So you see this one has duffel mat, this one has duffel mat, this one has duffel mat. They all have the same material, so they come in with a single texture set, right? So the benefit of this is it's simple to work with, it's easy to manage, and with a single UV tile, right, we're going to end up with a really small handful of maps. The disadvantage of this is that this texture map is very, how do you say it? In order to get like high resolution textures, what I have to do is I have to keep scaling the size of this texture map up. So if I zoom in, you can start to see that this starts to break down and has really not that much resolution to it. So I can't really do any high detail shots. What I could do is I can, set the size of my texture set to a higher value, and it's going to go ahead and recalculate all those layers I have, and so I'll have higher resolution. But even then at 4K, which is pretty big, it's still pretty low res. Looks better from far away, but it's still pretty low res. We could, when we export, we can export at 8K, but I can't really work in 8K in here. So it gets kind of hard to work with having like really large texture sizes. And it also means that essentially by scaling up our texture size, so if we double it, so if we go from 2K to 4K or 4K to 8K, I'm actually quadrupling the size of my texture image. So if I needed twice as much texture space, by doubling the texture size, I'm actually quadrupling it. So the alternative, which I'll show in a second, is having multiple smaller textures and having our having multiple maps. So breaking our object down into more UV tiles, and so that we don't have to have super huge texture sizes because each part of my model is taking up more space on this UV layout. But we'll take a look at that in a second. The other disadvantage I have here, because I have this all as one material, is not really an easy way to isolate anything, right? I come to this texture set list, click on that, and I hide the whole object. So let's say I wanted to move this strap here so I can kind of paint under here, or I wanted to paint this, let's go over here and just hide that. If I wanted to paint this metal piece here, right, but then these other objects are getting in the way, it's just hard to manage the object. In the new versions of Substance Painter, there's actually a pretty great tool now that can kind of get around this workflow. Because before, what we'd have to do is we have to give everything a individual material, and that has its own downsides, which was great. Which is the great part about it is it gives us, depending on how many materials we have, we can come in here and hide each object that has its own unique material, and I'll show you guys that in a little bit. But it meant that we would actually have to export multiple texture maps or figure out how to combine our texture maps together. So don't worry about that right now. But now we have in the newer versions this geometry selection tool. So if you click on this, what it's going to do is it's going to let you choose to create a mask based on your essentially your object. So we also can do it based on UV tile, which we'll show when we actually have UV tiles. I only have one, so I can't choose it. But I can actually set this, so let's set it to exclude all, and I want to do just this part, and this part, right? When I'm done with that, I can just click off on the layer, and let's go ahead and show that layer. So you can see it's masking that. That's great, but I kind of, I want to see underneath it. I want to paint here, but this object's in the way. So there's actually a button here that lets me isolate the stuff that's actually just in this layer. So it's using this isolation tool right here, and it's only showing me the objects that have been selected through this, right? So it's kind of like a mask, but it's more of like an object selection. So definitely, if you have multiple objects broken out, this gives you a lot of flexibility inside Substance Painter. And so because I came into this object, you'll see almost all of these assets are actually broken out as separate objects. It'd be different though if they were all combined. Let's go ahead and I'm going to do a quick setup just to show you what that looks like. Okay, so in this example, it's the same setup, right? I have a single material, right? It's all packed in one UV shell. But you'll see here, I actually combine them all into one mesh. So this is one single object. So inside of Substance Painter now, what I can do is, if I come here and I try to use this tool, I can't actually select different objects because they're not separate objects in Maya. They're actually combined together in one mesh. So that's kind of a huge pain in the butt. So as you're going to see in a second, there's going to be a lot of different ways we can control this for Substance Painter. So you can have them all as one mesh, but multiple UV tiles. You can have them as separate meshes, but one UV tile, and any mixture in between. They can have all different materials or one material, and so it's kind of based on how you want to work. But if you want to take advantage of this cool tool, we either need multiple UV tiles or we need our mesh to be made up of multiple parts. So here's that version where these are all separate objects inside of Maya. So it's not this one, it is this one. So these are all separate objects. Okay, so just as a recap. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and show you guys the next example. So this is with one material, and so that object selection tool is really cool, really helps me out. I'm going to go ahead and include all. So I'm going to show you another example, and this is kind of the way that we used to do this. And if you're using assets that we kind of give you guys, there's a chance that it might come in like this, so it's just good to be aware of how it's set up in Maya. You kind of have to open it up and bring it into Maya to really understand it. So in this next version, what it has is, if you look over in my, one second, attribute editor, you can see these all have actually different materials. Not all of them, right? So this one has a bag material, this one has the bottom panel material, this one has a belt material, this one has a lumbar pad material, this one has a bag handle material. So they are separate objects, which is cool. They could be combined into one object and be kind of the same approach, but in this case, they're all assigned a unique material. So the reason for that is so that it's easier for the artist to separate these objects and hide and show them inside of Substance Painter. And so I'm not going to go into the reasons of why we want to use one over the other for every kind of situation, but sometimes that's useful, right? A lot of times what people do is they'll take everything that's kind of a similar material, and like let's say all the metal pieces, and they'll go ahead and give them all the same material just because it helps organize their scene. If I come into that Hypershade editor, right? Let's say I go ahead and let's pull that over. If I select the compression straps, select all the objects with that material, so it's all four of those share the same material. If I grab the buckles, select objects with buckles, all those metal pieces, those metal buckles that might have the exact same material on them, or maybe made of the same metal, all have the same material. So let's see what that looks like in Substance Painter. Okay, so this is the version that has multiple materials, and so I have a bunch of materials, right? I assigned each of these objects its own material, and you see in the texture set list, now these are all separated out, right? So it's cool because it makes it easy for me to isolate models, much like I did with that geometry selection tool. But the main disadvantage on this is advantage/disadvantage, depends on how your workflow is and how you set this model up to work with you. But, if I do something on this layer, so I'm currently on this bag layer, and let's say I also wanted this handle to be made of the same material, right? It has its own layer stack, right? They're separated. So that's kind of a huge pain in the butt, right? If I wanted to make sure this material that I'm building here is also affecting other parts that have the same material. You can get around that by going to the material layer, and then let's go here, and I can just do instantiate across texture sets, and I can choose just bag handle. But it's a little slow, and so if I can come into bag handle or bag, and I can so this one's actually referencing it, so I can't actually edit it inside this layer. I'd have to go to this bag texture set and then edit it here. So yeah, so the multiple material method has its purposes, but in all honesty, I think it has more disadvantages. And one of those disadvantages is how it exports your textures. So let me show you guys what that looks like. So you can see here that I have essentially a set of textures for every single material that I have in here on that object. So each unique material has its own set of textures. And that's honestly not that great. It's not very efficient usage of our texture space, right? Because this texture map, right, is only taking up this much space, and all this stuff is just wasted, right? Because that's where the other UV tiles are. And if I come down to, let's see, I'll do the rib bolt color. Let's do that. Bolt base. Actually, since these are all, okay, these are all blank, so they're not going to really show you anything. But if I come in and look at it in Substance Painter, right, if I take a look at each of these texture set lists, right, they're all taking only a small portion. And when I export the texture map for it, it's a big texture map, right? It's a 2K or 4K texture map, but it's only utilizing this much space. So it's kind of a huge waste. There are some things you can do though to do this workflow and then combine let's say the base color map for all of these materials together into one texture map. Let me go ahead and bring that up. So you can search this. It's called the Texture Set Combiner, and it's made specifically for Substance Painter. So if you export out multiple materials as texture sets, which give you all these inefficiently used many texture maps, what this does is it combines them together into a single texture map. So it takes all those base color maps and combines them into a single base color map. It takes all those specular roughness maps, combines them together into one combined specular roughness map. So if you guys do like the multiple texture set workflow, which is where you give each object its own material, and then in Substance Painter, right, I have all these texture sets. If you like that workflow, maybe look into using this tool, because it's a great way of taking all those inefficiently created maps and combining them to one more efficient texture map. But yeah, so that's an option out there if you guys want to work with it. I'm going to do the same thing with this one, where I just export the texture map. So this is the one where we have a single material applied to the whole thing, which is giving me a single texture set list. And if I take a look at that in here, let's go packed one material, you can see it's combining the color input, or the color information, base color information, from every single object into one texture map, right? So way more efficient, way easier to work with. So yeah, generally speaking, I recommend that you guys do the one material approach, so single texture set list. So assign the same material to it. Let's just call it duffel material, right? And then have those pieces separated as objects if possible, so that you can do that geometry selection method inside of Substance Painter to isolate the layer, right? So going in here, using this geometry isolation tool right here, and then let's exclude all, and that way I can kind of focus on certain areas and quickly mask them, and then I can come in here and then let's go back to here and then turn on this visibility tool. So it lets me hide and show stuff. So it's a pretty cool tool. It's fairly new, and I definitely recommend it. Okay, but the issue that we're still running into here is, even though that workflow works a little bit better, right, my texture resolution's still really small, right? Because they're all packed into a single UV. So I'm going to show you the UV tile, UDIM tile, depends on where you're coming from, workflow, where we are going to use multiple UV tiles and they're going to have their own texture maps. So it does in some way like start to feel like it's getting more inefficient in the sense that we're getting more texture maps, but in this case, it's going to be using like a naming system that makes it really easy for the renderer to know that there's multiple texture images and plug them in at the same time. And it also, this is more efficient. Having multiple small texture maps is more efficient than needing to create a really large texture map for a single UV tile. Just in terms of resource costs, it's cheaper. Okay, here I have my multi-tile setup. So if I come and look at this here, I've broken my UV shells into multiple tiles, which means that each part of this model has more texture space to work with, right? A larger part of a texture map is being used for each piece of my model. And so you'll see here, I've cranked this up to 4K, just like the other one, but you can see how much more high resolution this is compared to the other one. The other one, it was blurry even when I cranked it up to 4K because it was all packed into a single UV tile. But because I've broken it into more UV tiles, they have more space on the texture maps or the UV space, which means that they have more resolution they can work with. Okay. The other advantage of having multiple UV tiles is you can also get selections based on your UV tiles. So if I come over here and let's say I'm going to turn on this blue layer, right? This is just going to turn it blue. And just like before, we could do it based on object, right? So we can do based on mesh name. So I can hide and select things based on their mesh names. Let's say exclude all, and I'll include this, 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 and this for this blue layer. And we'll just click off, right? Or I can even do the same thing based on UV tiles. So let's say I only want to do the body. So let's do exclude all. And since I put all of the body on its own UV tile, right, I can just click on that. And then I can click off. And now it's just doing the body. And again, I can do that visibility mode so I can look at just the body and hide everything else. So you can actually cleverly arrange or decide which UV shells go into which tile so you can kind of separate and isolate things based on what type of objects they are, or if they're overlapping or hiding something. So in this case, I specifically set it up so that I can come in and like all these objects here in 1002, I got them so that they would not be overlapping each other. So you can see they're all separate. So I can kind of get in and I can easily kind of look at all sides of the model if I wanted to. Not always need to, but if I wanted to, without another object getting in the way, right? And I kind of did the same thing with, let's see, this one right here, right? So if I'll come out here, right? Again, maybe there's some, there's some object overlapping here, so maybe I could have put that in a different UV tile. But again, for the most part, I'm trying to get objects that aren't overlapping each other just because it makes it easy for me to isolate and show things and work on backs and small areas of my model, or texturing my model without the rest of the model getting in the way. And then I also actually separated mine out, all the metals, into its own texture maps, which is debatable because you can see how little I'm actually using this UV space. So it's not the best, to be completely honest. Like, this isn't the most efficient thing, but I specifically did this just so it's easy for me to separate and isolate the metals. So if I wanted to, what I could do is let's set this all to include all, and then I'm going to add let's just add a gold material. So I'll just grab gold, and then I'm going to go ahead and have this gold only affecting the metals, right? So I can very easily and quickly affect just the metals, and it's still loading, so it'll be there in a second. There you go. So now when I come back out, let's turn off that visibility, right? I can easily select all those metals and just give them a gold. So this is all very flexible, right? In terms of, these are all different kind of workflows, like separating them by objects, separating them by materials, separating them by UV space. They all have their advantages and disadvantages, and you can kind of mix and match them based on your need and your preferred workflow. So we're using these multiple UV tiles, right, which gives us more texture resolution. Again, I want to reiterate that this is probably not going to be as used in real-time engines and games and VR and AR because having more texture maps is more expensive. So you would probably do the single material or the multiple texture sets that you then combine down together using that tool, that texture set combiner, because you want fewer texture maps, you want lower resolution, so the real-time engine can run faster. But if we're using VFX and animation, we have more resources available to us, and so we can go ahead and do the multi-UV tile setup so that we can have larger texture maps and more texture space. So next, what I want to show you guys is how this is going to look when I try to combine or attach this to a texture map, or sorry, into a material in RenderMan. Well, first, actually, let's go ahead and export these textures. So I'm actually going to hide that blue one, and we'll do something like this. So I'll go ahead and export these textures, and I'm going to go ahead and put them in a different location. So I'll put them in the UV tile space, and we'll export. So you'll see the disadvantage, one of the disadvantages of this one's it's actually creating more texture maps, right? So it's going to give me each UV tile I have is going to have its own set of textures: base color, roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, whatever. This one's also going to have base color, metallic, roughness, etc., etc., etc. So each one of these UV tiles is going to have their own set of all of those channel maps as a texture map. So that is one of the disadvantages. But, well, I mean, disadvantage, we want that because we want more texture maps so we can have higher resolution. But it also means that we have to manage that a little bit better. So if I come in here, you can see that I have a base color, right? And so ignore the ACES CG part. We'll talk about that at a later date. You guys can safely ignore that for now because I did mine in ACES OCIO workflow, which you guys, unless you're intentionally doing it, shouldn't have to worry about. So, you know, we have our material name, the channel, which is base color, and then we have this 1001. So this one's 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004. So we have 4 base color maps, right? And corresponding to each of these UV tiles here. You can see that 4 has the gold ones, and that's why that gold one is gold, right? We have 4 roughness, we have 4 metallic, we have 4 normal map ones, we have 4 roughness ones, displacement, so the height is displacement. I called that roughness, but that was the displacement one, etc., etc. But in RenderMan and a lot of programs, they know now to recognize this naming convention _1001, so it knows that you can plug in a single texture map, quote unquote, and it's going to use that naming convention and see if there's other texture maps associated with it. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like in Maya. Okay, so here I've gone ahead and assigned a Pixar surface material to the whole object, right? So they all have one material. And I'm going to go ahead and attach a texture map to the color. So I think I'm doing it this way. Let's do it like that. Okay, there we go. So I'm just going to grab the Pixar texture node, and I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And we're going to find that file. So I'm going to go ahead and go to that location. So in this case, it's going to be downloads, duffel bag example, export textures, UV tile. And I'm going to go ahead and choose this one. Let's go start with the base color. So I'm going to go to base color, ACES. Okay, and I'll say open. Okay, and I'm going to pause this while it goes ahead and figures it out for me. Okay, so you can see here, ignore the gold, obviously, because I would want to make that metallic, and I'd need to plug in either a metallic map or just give it a metal shader instead. But you can see here, it's gone ahead and on this material, I have a single color texture coming in. So I'm just loading in a single image. But you can see here, this might be kind of hard to see. So let's see if I can get this a little bit closer for you guys. So I think this works, hopefully. So this might be weird. I'm sorry if you guys can't see this. I don't know how this works with recording. But, we have this right here where it's using this UDIM name right here. So anytime you see a UDIM, that is essentially a naming convention for UV tiles. So that 0.1001, 0.1002, which indicates which UV tile it represents, is going to be a UDIM name. And so let's go ahead and I'll close this thing. So when I go back and look at those, right, so we have that, right, 1001, 1002, 1003, right? And so it's just replacing that with UDIM. So I'm just loading in a single map, and what it does is it knows to go in and look and say, okay, this object here, right? This is the 1001 UV tile. I'm going to use the first texture map for all those surfaces. So that first texture map goes on here. And then for all the surfaces that are in the 1002 texture UV tile, it's going to use that second image, and so on and so forth. So it's pretty handy because most programs nowadays know how to kind of handle or understand the nomenclature of multiple UV tile sets. So it's easy for you to just load it in and use it that way. So I think what I might do next is I might just show you guys just really quickly some UV stuff. We can talk about that more at another time in class and another lecture, but I'll just go over some really quick basics. But for the most part, that is the general gist of why you would want to have, you know, UV tiles versus everything packed into one UV tile, multiple UV tiles versus one UV tile, and also one material with multiple objects, right? So these are all separate objects versus having just one mesh or having multiple materials, right? So just as a quick recap, if we have our object as separate pieces of geometry, let me go ahead and make this a little bit darker because I made this a little bit brighter. No, that one. Bring that down. Okay. So just as a recap, right? If we have our object is one material that has multiple UV tiles, and so if it has multiple UV tiles, I can mask it based on UV tile, and if it has multiple objects, I can mask it based on object, right? So I can select objects or you know, hide or show objects using this geometry isolation tool, right? And if I want to actually visibly isolate it, like in my camera, what I can do is I can go ahead and click on this button right here, which is going to hide all of the other objects. So if we're going to use, which I recommend, the multi-UV tile and the multiple object workflow, this is kind of the base setup, or this is the basic setup, and this is how the advantages of it. So really quickly, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about if you need to rearrange your UVs for any reason, some things to keep in mind. So I'm not going to go over how to, you know, arrange this or cut it up like in a particular way, because I think that's just kind of outside the scope of what I want this video to be. But in this case, if I wanted to, I can close that outliner for now. If I wanted to, like, let's say, scale this up, right? Because it's all packed in one UV tile, but I want multiple UV tiles so I can get more texture resolution. What I do is I would first, one thing I like to do is I kind of like to separate things out. So I might go ahead and select objects, select these UVs, and then move them over here, right? I might select some objects that are kind of small that I might combine together or kind of pack their UV tiles together. So I might like maybe grab, right, all of these guys. So I think it's this one, right? Maybe these guys as well, right? Sometimes this, I mean, this comes with practice. Sometimes it's arbitrary, right? And then I can go into UV shell mode, and then I can take them together. And then what I would do is I would just go ahead and lay them out together, and that just kind of packs them a little bit tighter. And I'm just going to move them off to the side because I want to kind of keep this my little working space. This is kind of like my bench or my workshop, right? And I'll do that with the rest of the UVs as well. I'll just kind of go through and keep doing that, but I'm just going to kind of ignore these guys for now, because I just want to get through this pretty quickly. So if I want to scale up my UVs, what I need to do is I need to still make sure that they're going to fit in singular UV tiles, right? I can't have UVs that stretch across multiple UV tiles, because then the whole system breaks down in Substance, and RenderMan doesn't know what to do with that, right? It causes a lot of errors. So they still can't cross these boundaries. They can be in multiple UV tiles. They can be anywhere in here, technically, but they can't cross across the boundary. So what I usually do is if I want to scale them up, I look at what my largest UV shell is. So in this case, it's going to be this one. There is one up here that's another contender. It's not the largest in terms of area size, but it's the largest in a single dimension, which will cause a problem, but we'll look at that in a second. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and scale this up so that it's pretty much as big as I can make it without actually crossing over. Something you can do is you can turn on this UV or the little checkerboard, and you'll see that when you've gone too far, it'll actually start activating the other one. So it's kind of like a nice cheap little way you can you know, do that. And I of course don't want any overlapping, right? So that looks good, but the problem is these are actually unevenly scaled. So if I take a look at this object and I go ahead and turn on the checkerboard pattern, right, you can see that these squares are not the same size as these squares. And so that means that these have a disproportionate amount of space in the UV space. So this object proportional to each essentially like polygon or each, I guess, physical unit, like each evenly sized unit of this surface has way more space than each surface on these UV shells, right? So that's going to be a problem because what it's going to do is it's going to lead to a couple issues. One is it's going to make it so that if I put out a procedural pattern on this, it's going to essentially be unevenly sized. So let me show you really quickly what that looks like. So here you can see, because these are unevenly sized, right, or don't have the equivalent texture space within here, then those, if I use like a tileable or procedural pattern, their sizes actually be different, and that's going to be really frustrating later on. It also means that this one is going to have a different resolution, right? So if you look at this, you don't really see the texture resolution that much, right? I mean, a little bit. It's not the super high res image, but if you look here, you can clearly see that it's starting to get kind of pixelated. And that, of course, becomes more and more exacerbated by how small that is, right? If I bring it really small, right, we can start to see that has very, very little resolution. So we're getting a lot of artifacting and low res resolution to that. So that is one of the problems, or that's both of those problems of this having uneven texel size or texture space or UV space proportional to their 3D space. And so another way of looking at this is if this object here, let's take a look at them here, and I'll turn off the texture. So this shell here, this piece of geometry, let's say it's 2 times the size of this piece right here. What we want is, if this is 2 times the size of this right here, we want its UV shell to be 2 times the size of this one's UV shell. So they should be proportional to each other in the UV space as they are in the 3D space. And so what we call that is a texel density. So texels is essentially the size, it's kind of like pixels, right? It's the texture size unit, right, of in this space. It doesn't equate to pixels, right, because pixels are image-based and this isn't necessarily image-based yet, but we call them texels, right? And so if they have an uneven size of texels compared to their unit size or their 3D unit size, then we have an uneven texel density. So texel density is going to be that, size of the object compared to the UV space, right? So if I click on this guy right here and I say get, so this is under transform, and then down here we have texel density, which is pixels per unit. I click get, it's going to tell me this whole UV shell has an average of 4.5 texel or units or pixels per unit. And if I select this one and I click get, you can see it's a different number. So a really easy way to fixing that is, one, you can scale them up at the same time, or you can get this guy's texel density and you can click on this guy and click set. And it's going to scale it up so that now they actually have the same exact texel resolution or UV space resolution. So you can see these squares are the exact same size as these squares. And I can do that same thing here. And I could do that on those other pieces. So if I go back out to these objects, right, and I have that already packed in, I've already loaded in the texel size of this, I can go ahead and select these other UV shells and set that. So it's going to scale them up so that they have that same texel density, which means that, when I turn on that checkerboard, they're all going to have the exact same sized squares on them, which means that they're going to have the same resolution in my textures, and they're also going to, if I use like a pattern or something like that, or some kind of regular repeating or tileable texture, that it's going to look the same across all of those surfaces, and there's not going to be that weird unevenness that we saw a second ago. So the other thing I wanted to kind of call to mind is, by doing that, the problem is now I have this UV shell right here that now can't fit in a single UV tile. It could maybe if you did it like this, right? So you could do it, it still doesn't, but sometimes doing a diagonal, you can do it. But there's actually different issues related to having diagonal UV shells. And that just has to do with, if you can make a UV shell align vertically or horizontally, you're going to have a better time, generally speaking. It's not always possible. Obviously, these aren't necessarily horizontal or vertical. But generally speaking, if you can do that with like a shell like this, which is more or less rigid or grid-like, then getting it to line up with those is good. But anyways, so I could scale it down, but the problem is now I have uneven texel size, which is going to lead to issues. I could scale everything down so that this now fits in, right? So I can scale it down so that they're all evenly sized, right? But now it's scaled to this guy instead of this guy. But the problem is I kind of lost a lot of that texel resolution, right? All these squares are bigger, which means my texture resolution is going to be smaller, or I'm not going to have as much texture space. So it's all a balancing act. So sometimes we do want to go ahead and scale that down so this fits in because I want to keep this as a single UV shell, right? In one situation. In another situation, what I might want to do is I might want to go ahead and cut it into multiple UV shells. So I just find an area where I'm not going to see the texture seam, right? Because anytime you cut your UVs, you're going to potentially get a texture seam. So I'll go here, and I'm just going to cut that, right? And so now you'll see that that can be fit into one tile. So it's all kind of a balancing act. Like I said before, do you want to have as few texture seams as possible? Or are you trying to have as little distortion of my UVs as possible, which means usually you cut up your model into more and more and more pieces? Or do I want as much texture resolution as possible? Then in that case, I would want to cut it into more pieces and have more UV seams. So it's, you kind of have to balance it out and know what you want. In this case, for VFX animation, especially since I'm using Substance Painter, where a lot of times I can kind of get around not doing stuff UV based, I personally prefer cutting it into more UV tiles. So some of the things I really wanted to call attention to here is, one, there's an issue here. I have these overlapping UVs. You never want overlapping UVs. Always make sure your UV shells are not overlapping anything. One thing you can do to kind of quickly get them to overlap is to use the layout feature. You want to go ahead and change that from its default settings. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this. Reset settings and click apply. So the problem with this that you might not see is that this was our texel density that we gotten. Let me get this. You'll see it's different because the default settings for the layout, let me go ahead and go ahead and set these to be the right texel density. So it scaled them. It's not that big a deal in this case, but if I let's say move those over, but I wanted to just do like a quick packing or layout of just these guys, and I clicked layout, you can see it's going to scale up huge. The settings I personally prefer is I like to get my texel density, right? So get, and then I'm going to set it on all of my other shells, right? So that they're all the same size or same texel density. And then what I do is I'll hold shift and click on this layout button to open up the options for it. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to turn off shell prescaling. I'm going to turn off scale mode. So it's not going to scale my model at all or my UVs at all. It's just only going to lay them out for me. So you can see it packed them out, but if I went ahead and got the texel density, you can see it's pretty much the exact same texel density. All it does is just make sure they're not overlapping each other and they all fit inside a single UV tile. Something you might have to check once in a while is if it's actually, I don't know, do I have to do that? Okay. Is that if it is actually overlapping, sometimes it crossing the borders. So we don't want overlapping UVs. We also, like I said before, we don't want our UVs to cross the border. So sometimes you can use this checkerboard or just zoom in close enough and just double check that it's not going across. Oh, there's a little tiny guy right there. The other thing we want to make sure is when you do the multi-UV tile setup, so let's say what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab these guys. I'm going to see if I can get them here. Let's get these guys out of the way. I'm going to go hide that. Just get that out of the way. And I'm going to get rid of that image. Okay. So I'm going to grab these guys. Let's see if I can pack these all into one tile. So I'll click on layout. Cool. So that's going to be my first UV tile. This is going to be my second UV tile. So I'll click layout. If I want to snap it over one full UV tile, so right, it's packed into one UV tile. Problem is it's in the same one. I can go up to transform. I can set this value right here to 1. By default, I think it's 0.1 or something. And I click on it right, and what it's going to do is it's going to move everything I've selected over one full UV tile. Okay, and I can do the same thing here. Grab that, click on layout, and then move it over 2 more. The main thing you really want is, like I said before, these can be in different UV tiles. They can be scattered around. I don't recommend it. I think it's good to try to keep them in the same row or the same 2 or 3 rows. But you do want your first or one UV tile here in the first 0 to 1 UV tile. So I don't recommend doing something like this where this first one's empty. I think I always recommend including that because some things like Substance Painter can not like that. They can kind of get a little fussy about that. So that's something I'd recommend too. So anyways, so these all are not overlapping the UV borders. They are not overlapping each other. So all the UV shells are spaced out. Something else I could have done, you can see they're pretty much touching. So that can be something that is kind of a problem sometimes. So also in here, what I might do is I might do shell padding and I might do something like 8 and click apply. So now you'll see that it's going to give just a little bit of a boundary between them. So sometimes that is something that you also have to be aware of. And then of course I'd apply that to these guys as well. But anyways, so shells aren't overlapping each other. They're not crossing this border. And they are, at least one of them is in this first UV tile. And so that's all you really need to do for the UV tile setup. The organizing them into multiple different UV tiles, like how you do that is up to you. I like to try to be as efficient as possible still. So I'll still try to like make sure that I'm not having too many like layouts where I have like maybe just 2 little tiny shells and 1 single texture map, because that's super inefficient. But yeah, so that's kind of what we want to work with. And this is something we'll talk about if we haven't already, is you just want to make sure you're exporting. So again, this one has separate objects. You're exporting that whole group of your objects as a FBX. So export selection as an FBX, give it a name, and it should keep all those names. It should keep all the UV information. It should keep all your smoothing on your surface, and you should be good to go.